I guess I definitely won't have notes for this one. This is gonna be coming from my memory. Okay, ready? For today's Thinking Thursday, we're going back to the beginning of the last century in Ireland. Prime Minister Herbert Asquith had lost parliamentary majority and was dependent on the Irish Parliamentary Party in order to keep his seats in Parliament. At the time, the British Empire ruled Ireland, and Ireland wanted to be freed of it. Prime Minister Herbert Asquith turned to IPP leader John Redmond and made a negotiation so that he would give the IPP more power and the home rule that they wanted, which would mean that Ireland could rule themselves and leave the British Empire if Herbert Asquith could stay as the parliamentary leader and the Prime Minister by having their support. This trade-off led to a promise that by the 18th of September in 1914, Ireland would have home rule, and this promise came in 1912. Now, unfortunately, at the beginning of 1914, the Irish people began to mistrust each other. So, Ulster, which is the northern part of Ireland, had this group called the Volunteers, and the Volunteers wanted to remain within the British Empire. However, the rest of Ireland wanted independence. They wanted their home rule. This started to cause a ruckus between the two sides. And Herbert Asquith formed a little cabinet of 5 leaders, including Churchill, to figure out how to solve this problem because it was becoming more and more aggressive. Churchill actually said there are worse things than bloodshed, even on an extended scale, because he wanted this to become a fight that the Irish people would sort out for themselves. However, there was a mutiny called the Curragh Mutiny, which was the British Army camp in Curragh in County Kildare, where 57 officers said they would resign rather than fight against the Ulster Volunteers. This was where the problems were becoming not just of the civil population, but also of the military population. They were refusing to do the bidding of the British government. And so Churchill wanted blood to be spilled and the problem to be solved that way. However, the Commander-in-Chief allowed the British Army to disappear rather than be in service without consequences, basically saying it's okay if you don't want to fight your own people. However, this meant that there was this doubt with the Irish population that the British Army were actually going to back them when home rule came in. The Curragh Mutiny was basically the British Army saying we're not going to fight against the Ulster Volunteers, and that meant that the Irish people felt that they weren't going to have the British government and the British Army supporting them for home rule when that change eventually came into act. To further the concern, in April 1914, the Ulster Volunteers actually landed 35,000 German rifles in Larne, which let the Southern Irish people know that they were getting ready to fight. So how did the people who wanted home rule respond? Well, in spring of 1914 in London, there was a lunch with the well-to-do of the Irish Republicans. So this was Alice Stepford Green, Sir Roger Casement, Darrell Figgis, Ian McNeill and George Fitzharding Berkeley, who came together and decided, well, if the Northern Irelanders, or as they were at the time, the Ulster Volunteers, are going to arm themselves, then we have to arm ourselves too. And so they set about gathering loads of funds, and they spoke to Michael O'Rahilly about getting a purchasing contract with a German rifle company. So this is exactly what Darrell Figgis and Erskine Childers did. They negotiated with Moritz Magnus der Jüngere in Hamburg for quite a lot of rifles and ammunition on May the 28th, 1914. Erskine then set about spreading a rumour through British intelligence that this shipment would be arriving in Ireland but on a fishing trawler, not on a yacht, when Erskine Childers and his wife Molly had received a yacht for their wedding present. Molly came from a very well-to-do family, the Osgoods, who were one of the actually first families in America on the Mayflower. And her father, who was a physician, had quite a lot of money and gifted them this yacht called the Asgard. And this is what they intended to go and pick the rifles up in, a yacht, not a fishing trawler. This meant that the British intelligence were actually thrown off and they spent their time looking for a fishing trawler that was never there. The team had backup from another yacht called the Kelpie. We'll come to the Kelpie in a minute because there's someone very special on board. But first, let's start on July 3rd in Conway in Wales, where there's Erskine and Molly Chowders, Mary Springrice, Gordon Shepherd, Charlie Duggan and Patrick McGinley. And they are setting sail firstly to go to Cowes in England, where they meet up with the Kelpie. Now the Kelpie is very special. On board was Connor and Kitty O'Brien, who were Mary Springrice's cousins, George Cahill, Tom Fitzsimmons and Diarmuid Coffey. So if you've seen my other video, you know that Diarmuid Coffey is the husband of Cesca Trench. So if you haven't watched it, go watch that video. But for now, this is the crew on board of the Kelpie, which is a slightly smaller yacht. And they spend 2 days repairing the Asgard, and then on July 10th, they set sail for the North Sea. So they're not going all the way to Hamburg, they're just gonna meet this boat called the Gladiator in the North Sea, and then take on all of the cargo. So July 10th, they've set off for the North Sea. July 12th, they meet the Gladiator in the North Sea, and it takes 5 hours to load all of the guns and ammunition onto the yacht. On July 19th, they arrive back in Milford Haven, and there's so much space taken up by the rifles and ammunition that they actually have nowhere to sleep on board. So they take a little pit stop, and like July 20th, they go to Holyhead so that they can repair the broken sails because they've been in a horrible storm. And then on July 24th, they experienced the worst storm of decades, and these are 2 very small yachts, and so the fact that they did this is kind of wild, but they still set sail for Howth. These are tiny yachts going through one of the worst storms that has been seen for decades, and they've literally just repaired their sails, and yet they're going for it. I'm here at the very windy Howth Harbour, which is exactly the spot that they decanted all of their armoury, having brought it all the way over from Germany. On the 20th of July, they'd had to stop in Holyhead in Wales in order to repair the broken sails, and they set sail again on the 24th of July for here, Howth Harbour. Howth Harbour is the peninsula of Dublin, and this was their final destination. On the 26th, they arrived, but unfortunately, they were supposed to be met by a motorboat that would help them bring all the cargo inland, but it simply didn't come. They were hovering just north of Howth Harbour here, but to their great luck, there was tens of volunteers waiting here at Howth Harbour to help decant all of their cargo. They managed to safely deposit everything they had on board, and it was taken into Dublin for the Easter Rising. All of these people start taking the guns and ammunition into Dublin city. The police are intercepting. There's a riot that breaks out, and on Bachelor's Walk, things suddenly explode into a riot. The police are threatening everybody. There's this crowd of people who are marching rifles and ammunition into the city, determined to defend themselves. And yet, they actually aren't going to use these guns and ammunition now. This is not what these guns and ammunition were for. They're saving them. The police know this. They are technically unarmed. So then, what do? Well, they pick up rocks and stones. They start stoning the police, and the police fire back at them. The police don't have to save their weaponry for anything, so they start firing into the crowd, and 138 people are killed from the crowd. This is why this becomes the Bachelor's Walk massacre. So what happens next? Well, Ireland was promised home rule in 1914, right? We were waiting for the 18th of the 9th, 1914, in order to get that home rule. Well, Britain joined World War I, and in doing that, on the 4th of August, they paused home rule. This is why years later the Easter Rising happened, because Ireland hadn't got their promised home rule. This is why they needed the weapons, because they knew the British government wasn't really going to fulfill its promise. They knew and could smell the betrayal coming. What happened to Erskine Childers? Well, Erskine Childers was actually executed for possession of a small handgun, which is ironic given the fact that he'd managed to negotiate the purchase and then the shipment of 900 rifles and 49,000 rounds of ammunition. When he was killed, he actually asked his son to shake the hand of everyone who'd signed his death warrant. His son, Erskine Hamilton Childers, went on to become a Taoiseach, which is like an Irish Prime Minister. Unfortunately, the Irish Republic only won its freedom through bloodshed and violence with the guns that it had been provided by these brave soldiers. And I call them soldiers because even though they weren't working for any specific army, they were fighting for themselves. They were soldiers of their own freedom, and they won their own freedom. But that brave act meant that Ireland is now free from the British Empire. There are a lot of reasons why the British Empire could have been seen as a good thing. It having power, it being able to share that power with the Irish people. But unfortunately, in most cases, it was exercising that power on the Irish people, causing an aggression and an oppression that the Irish people couldn't take anymore. Thankfully, these people who did actually have both the connections and the funds to arm their own people managed to arm their own people and fight for their own freedom. Ireland is now a republic because of the bravery of these people.